Top Hungarian official Anita Orbán spent a few years in the United States between 1998 and 2002, and this was, of course, at a very pivotal time in U.S. history, given 9/11 occurred while she was there, and then we saw the rapid acceleration of the national security state. So I was very curious as to what exactly Anita Orbán was doing in the United States during this time. I wanted some more details, of course, and I was able to find more details and obtain a better understanding and obtain more clarity regarding her time in the U.S. after finding her 2007 resume, which was attached to her PhD thesis. So there was a lot of good information in there, and I wanted to break it down. As previously reported, Anita Orbán interned at the Heritage Foundation. She also was working at the Hudson Institute in the summer of 2001. So this is just right before 9/11. And the Hudson Institute is an American-based research organization focused on defense, international relations, economics, energy, and more. And upon reviewing this 2007 resume, I also learned that Anita Orbán held a position with the Forum of the Brzezinski Chair of Scholars, which was run by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS. And I was actually not previously aware of this. And to specifically quote Anita Orbán's resume, she says that she was a member of He Forum of the Brzezinski Chair of Scholars. Anita Orbán would go on to earn her PhD. And please keep in mind that that resume was attached to her PhD. She eventually earned the PhD from the Boston-based Tufts University, and she completed most of her PhD while in Budapest. And at the time that she submitted her thesis, she was in fact serving as a deputy director for the International Center of Democratic Transition. And according to an archived website, this organization's purpose was to collect and share the experiences of past democratic transitions. And George Herbert Walker, the cousin of former President George W. Bush, was one of the international board members, as was Donald Blinken, who was the father of the former Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And both of these men were former U.S. ambassadors to Hungary. So back to Anita Orbán's PhD. And I am actually not going to address the substance of the PhD. It is worth noting, however, that it is focused on Russian energy companies' expansion into Eastern Europe, and that is absolutely worth researching and investigating, perhaps for another time. But I wanted to specifically point to the acknowledgments and the reference sections because this provides a window of insight, at least, into Anita Orbán's inner circle and her professional affiliations at the time in the early 2000s when she was living and studying in the United States. So in her acknowledgments section of her PhD, she specifically shares by name supportive friends, her family members as well, colleagues, associates, and of course, she includes her dissertation committee. The committee chair was Robert L. Pfaltzgraff Jr., and the other two members were Lisa Lynch and Professor William C. Martle. We'll start with the committee chair. So Robert L. Pfaltzgraff Jr. was a professor of international security studies at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, of course, for many, many years. And he was, in fact, a faculty member with the university since 1971. And according to an archived page from the State Department dated 2001 to 2009, it also states that Pfaltzgraff was the founder and president of the Institute of Foreign Policy Analysis, or IFPA. And according to the website, the IFPA is an independent organization that conducts research, prepares policy briefings, and organizes conferences and seminars in the U.S. and internationally. The page also states that the IFPA undertakes studies on a broad range of issues, including proliferation, countering weapons of mass destruction, the future of alliances, security cooperation, national security strategy, military modernization and transformation, and homeland security. You get it. Also, it goes on to list Robert Pfaltzgraff's areas of specialty, very similar to what I had just mentioned. Basically, he was an expert in international relations theory, crisis management, homeland security, missile defense, space strategy, and also an expert on the long war against terrorism. And again, remember, this is an archived website from 2001 to 2009. And after Pfaltzgraff passed away, the University of Pennsylvania put out a tribute to honor him. And this tribute specifically stated that he was the visionary behind the establishment of Fletcher's International Securities Program, laying the foundation for numerous graduates to embark on impactful careers in foreign service and security intelligence. And one of those graduates was Anita Orbán. Now, additionally, Pfaltzgraff's work went beyond just academic affiliations. He had a lot of professional experience as well. He advised government officials on military and defense strategy, on terrorism, national security, and homeland security. He also worked with several U.S. presidential administrations, including the Reagan administration. The tribute to him also goes on to state that he was a member of the Reagan Defense Advisory Team formed before President Reagan's election in 1980. After the fall of the Soviet Union, he briefed President George Herbert Walker Bush, that's Bush Sr., and others on foreign policy planning. Robert Pfaltzgraff was also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and just to remind you, this was the chair of Anita Orbán's dissertation committee. Now, another committee member that is worth looking at is Professor William C. Martle. William C. Martle, in addition to working as a professor at the Fletcher School, he also worked as a professor of national security affairs at the Naval War College. And according to a biography associated with his academic work, Professor Martle directed a number of studies on space and policy issues for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, as well as the U.S. Air Force, the Office of Secretary of Defense, and he was also a professional staff member of the Rand Corporation in D.C. Now, for my European listeners, that DARPA connection absolutely stands out because DARPA is a branch of the Department of War that conducts research on new military technologies. Much of this research is considered to be highly controversial, and DARPA is controversial by nature just for conducting research that seems to really push the ethical boundaries. And Professor Martle also had professional experience. He was a senior policy advisor to Mitt Romney during his 2012 presidential campaign, and like some of the other people associated with Anita Orbán, he also served as an advisor on the National Security Council.
I think we need, and I could actually tie Russia and China to this, but we're focusing on China. We need to restrain China's tendency, as well as Russia's tendency, to support authoritarian regimes. You can make the list as long as you want. We all know the states. We think of North Korea. We think, in the case of China, a little bit less peripherally with support with Russia in the UN Security Council against Syria and Iran. And this worries, and this ought to worry the international community when states, great powers, are supporting regimes whose records are essentially appalling.
In Anita Orbán's acknowledgement section on her PhD thesis, she also goes on to thank personal friends of hers who supported her throughout her research. And in one section, she writes, "My great friends, Susan Fink Yoshihara and Margaret Sloan, were my hosts when I went back to Boston to do research and shared their apartments with me, and thus made my stay and work a very pleasant experience. I thank you both very much." So both of these women were obviously close friends of Anita Orbán, and I do want to focus on Margaret Sloan in particular. If you look at her LinkedIn page, she is a PhD and also works with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS. And her LinkedIn shows that her specialties include weapons of mass destruction and national security. She also previously worked at the then Department of Defense, now the Department of War, as a special advisor to the DASD, and I believe that is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for countering WMDs, that is weapons of mass destruction, at the Pentagon. Sloan was also an associate at Booz Allen Hamilton. Sloan also worked as a senior policy fellow at the Center for the Study of WMDs at National Defense University. And from 1996 to 1997, she was a research associate with the Council on Foreign Relations. And if you had any doubts that this woman was the same Margaret Sloan that is referenced in Anita Orbán's PhD thesis, you don't have to wonder, because if you looked at her LinkedIn page, she in fact recently shared a post from Anita Orbán dated early 2026. So I can say with a rather high degree of certainty that this is the same individual and that the two of them may very well still be friends. But this is just yet again another person who was a part of the U.S. government, who was deeply embedded with the national security state and the military apparatus, who was a close friend and associate of Anita Orbán. And another notable reference of Anita Orbán's can be found at the end of her PhD thesis in the reference section, where she lists all of her regular consultations, and one of them, a notable one, included historian Richard Pipes. And according to this reference page, it states that Anita Orbán, in fact, had 2 personal meetings with Richard Pipes between 2003 and 2004. And Richard Pipes was a historian and a professor of history at Harvard. His area of expertise was Russia and the Soviet Union. He shares many similarities with the other individuals associated with Anita Orbán. Richard Pipes worked with the Reagan administration in the early 80s, and he held a position on the National Security Council. He was also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he closely advised the Reagan administration on its policy toward the Soviet Union. In a 2003 interview with C-SPAN, which is archived online in print format, he also disclosed that he attended 2 Bilderberg meetings, and you could also find this information elsewhere online.
You found yourself at some time, and you might remember what the date was, at the Bohemian Grove in California, which is an exclusive club, I think, isn't it, of some kind?
Well, it's an exclusively male club.
And why were you there?
Well, I was invited by a friend who was a member.
And when was this? Was this while you were on the NSC?
No. That was afterwards.
Well, the quote I'm going to read is, "Pipes, I can destroy you. How? By saying that I agree with you. It was a fine example of his self-deprecatory humor." You're talking about Henry Kissinger.
Right.
And what was your relationship with him during all this?
Well, at first it was very friendly because he tried to get into the Reagan administration. But then he didn't get in because Reagan did not like him. And he sort of faded away. So I used to meet him occasionally, both here and abroad, at various conferences. For example, Bilderberg conference, I met him. And, we talked and so on. But he was not involved in policy at all.
Most notably, however, in 1976, Richard Pipes led Team B. And Team B was a group of analysts and military experts who were convened at the direction of then director of the CIA, George Bush Sr. And the purpose of this group was to assess the CIA's 1975 National Intelligence Estimate on the Soviet strategic objectives.
The argument of Team B was that the Soviet leadership does not share the mutual assured destruction doctrine, that they believe in fighting and winning a nuclear war. And that's, of course, been confirmed ever since in various ways. We now know for sure. And that did impress him. And that is why he wanted so much to build up America's military resources. The CIA people, generally graduates of American colleges and universities, had great difficulty understanding the Soviet mindset. They assume that basically we're all the same, and they think pretty much the same we do. And my argument was, and I had the great difficulty persuading them of it. I even had the difficulty persuading the president of that the Russians think differently. That's where the Team B came in. They assumed that the Russians thought the way we did about the utility of nuclear weapons. And learning about the Russian mindset is the most important task for the CIA and very difficult to accomplish.
And speaking very generally, the Team B report, their final conclusion was that the CIA had underassessed and underestimated the threat of the Soviet Union at the time. And according to the Team B intelligence report, it states, Team B feels the USSR strives for effective strategic superiority in all branches of the military, nuclear forces included. It goes on to state, their military doctrine is measured not in Western terms of assured destruction, but in those of a war-fighting and war-winning capacity. So this Team B was claiming that the Soviet Union at the time did not view nuclear weapons as a deterrent. And today, many of the assessments of this Team B report indicate that this Team B was very much over-exaggerating the threat of the Soviet Union at the time. The Team B assessment is also often criticized for not being very fact-based and focusing too much on the ideology of the Soviet Union. And Richard Pipes was the person who perpetuated these ideas, these misleading ideas and this exaggerated threat of aggression from the Soviet Union. And I get the sense that this also extended into his other works. And it is also reasonable to assume that this individual, Richard Pipes, informed much of Anita Orban's understanding of the Soviet Union and perhaps of modern-day Russia and Putin, because we know in the early 2000s, at the time that Richard Pipes was meeting with Anita Orban, he held very negative views on Russia and Putin. He viewed Russia as an autocracy, not a democracy, and as a totalitarian regime. So in summary, Anita Orban, the current Hungarian foreign minister and deputy prime minister, was educated by prominent pro-national security, pro-military individuals. And one could absolutely argue that that's what you would expect if you were studying international security and foreign policy in the United States. But Anita Orban is, after all, the current deputy prime minister and foreign minister of Hungary, and it is absolutely worth bringing this information to light. And many of the individuals in Anita Orban's circle were also on the National Security Council and were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. One even worked with DARPA, another perpetuated Cold War propaganda, being Richard Pipes, whom I had just mentioned. And close associates, friends of hers, even current friends of hers, are deeply embedded within the U.S. government, in the establishment, and also held positions in the Department of Defense, the Department of War, and were advising on WMD's national security and homeland security. Anita Orban also conducted an interview in October 2000 with former CIA Director James Woolsey in preparation and as part of research for her PhD. Her education took place in the United States during a very pivotal time in U.S. history, of course, the early 2000s, where 9/11 happened, and then you saw the rapid acceleration of the national security state. And while I have to acknowledge, of course, that Anita Orban is not a mirror of every single person in her circles at the time, and that she probably does not necessarily agree with every single position that each of these individuals has, these associations indicate a common pattern, and these associations are absolutely a reflection of Anita Orban.